Dr. Leanne Whitney, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Well, it's really great to have you, and we've played tag, trying to settle on a date, and things popped up in your life and my life where we had to kind of move it back a few times. So I'm glad that we're finally here and going to be able to have this interesting conversation, which is going to be about your book, which is titled Consciousness in Jung and Patañjali. And I know a fair amount about Jung, but very little about Patanjali. But let's get started with something of your background. I'm kind of curious, who you are, where did you come from, how did you get into all of this crazy stuff?
Probably like most of us in the field, I got into it because of my interest in levels of distress or suffering, and wanting to heal myself and my own wounds, as well as seeing the culture in pain at large. So that was definitely a great impetus for me in my 20s. I was actually really ill. I became physically sick, and I couldn't have told you this at the time, but it was psychosomatic, really, or like a spiritual crisis, really. So I got into studying mind-body medicine and the connection between the mind and the body, and I went to a lot of Western doctors, and when I found Eastern healers, it was a really big turn towards holistic and integrative practices. And it just kind of spiraled from there.
Yeah, where did you grow up?
Massachusetts, actually. I'm East Coast originally. I'm in LA now.
Yeah, okay. So, I'm just wondering if you were exposed to any of that sort of thing, or at home. Had you heard of psychotherapy, etc.?
Not at all. I grew up Catholic, actually.
Okay.
I think that's going to say a lot.
Yeah.
Towards why there was a mind-body split. There was a lot of rigidity and regimentation, and the teachings of Jesus, but love seemed extremely absent from a lot of what I witnessed with the nuns and the priests. And so yeah, there was a pretty severe split for me early on.
Yeah. Now, this book grew out of your doctoral dissertation, I gather.
Yes, it did.
That was at Pacifica, which is it's the go-to Jungian graduate school for. I'm curious, what did you major in as an undergraduate?
Actually, I did a degree in statistics over in Europe. That was my first degree. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting. You must have been good at math or something.
Very, very good.
How in the world did that happen?
Very good at that time. Looking at it now, it seems a world away. But when I was 18 years old, it was almost like the path of least resistance. I really wanted to travel, but going to college was really the thing to do. So I thought, how can I try to make the best of both worlds? And I got myself in Europe, and math was really easy for me at the time. So I just picked the path of least resistance, really.
Oh, wow. Well, that was a great plan. It shows that you were an adventurous soul even then, right? Right out of
very
high
much
school.
so.
Yeah. Go to Europe and get a degree at the same time, and probably have wonderful adventures along the way.
I did. I live it. I had already been exposed, actually. I had traveled a little bit. I had gone to Lawrence Academy, which was a boarding school, and we had this beautiful program that allowed us to travel in March of every year. So I had already been exposed to other cultures. I had lived with some indigenous folks down in Belize. I had been in Germany, and so it really had already given me the bug to learn about other cultures and other peoples.
Yeah. Do you remember when you first learned about Jung? How did you discover the work of Carl Jung?
Yes, I do remember. So as I said, in my 20s, I had that experience with physical illness. And then in my early 30s, in a yoga room, I had what's known as a pure consciousness event. So I had this big moment of moving beyond duality into non-duality, and having a momentary experience of pure consciousness.
Lucky
And
you.
yeah, it seems that way, but actually it was a lot, because I had never been, even though I was in a yoga asana room, I had never been exposed to any of the texts that let me know what that experience might have been about. So
Uh-huh. Yeah.
it was a lot at that time. But the first thing I was drawn to was the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I got the Evans Wentz translation, of which Jung had written the introductory commentary. So that was my first exposure. And shortly after that, a friend of mine who works for a company in England who bases off the Myers-Briggs called Insights, Learning and Development, told me about memories, dreams, reflections. And it was from then on that I was
From then
really,
on, once you encounter that book,
yeah,
you're on the ride.
exactly.
And then you went really on the ride, going very deeply into the theory and metaphysics and so on, and reading ancient texts and so on, which
Yes.
I never did. I got interested in yoga in the late 60s, early 70s, hatha yoga, and also a bit of kundalini yoga, uh, but never got into the esoteric original readings, etc. And I even taught hatha yoga for a while in the 70s, which is hard to believe now, given the stiffness of my body that comes with aging. Um, so, this book is based on a dissertation, and consequently, it's very scholarly. It's like you have to prove yourself to get that PhD. And
Right.
Pacifica is always, I think, striving to allow people to write dissertations that might not fly in other institutions. So they have to be particularly rigorous because it's not necessarily going to be based on an experiment, which is the golden standard across so much of the land. Um, and so I'm wondering how long it took you to write it, because it seems like it wouldn't have just happened overnight.
Right. I want to say it took me 2 years to write the original dissertation, and then it took me another 2 to rewrite it into the book. So um, really 4 years in all, I think you could say.
Well, that's pretty fast, I think, for the amount of material that you dealt with and had to cover. Um, and did you have any kind of a career or job that you were doing before you got into all of this graduate work?
Yeah, actually, so in my 20s, after I had that experience with illness, I actually started acting a little bit. It was a way for me to sort of open up my emotional body
Uh-huh.
and start to move in ways that I was looking for more creativity to start to free myself from all the mental, emotional, and physical pain that I experienced at that time. So I did some work in the theater and a little bit of work here and there in TV and film. And I had started making my own movies, because at the time it was when the digital video revolution was coming about. So
Yeah.
I made a documentary, The Fire Within. It's about a long-term AIDS survivor, which still plays now because of the current pandemic.
Yeah.
It's on Amazon Prime. And then I started making a second doc about the evolution of human consciousness. That's when I took a turn towards academia again and
Wow.
went and got a degree.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So is there anything more that you can say about that peak experience that you had, which, that it's beyond words, but if there are any words that you can wrap around it, because it's so germane to your path and to what your book is about.
Oh, yeah, very much so. So just very succinctly, consciousness is all there is. I mean, that's what that moment was all about, really, in a nutshell. It
Uh-huh.
was, it was, and it was the truest moment in some respects. I could say that I had lived to date, or because it was just so real.
Yeah.
Um,
And you had an experience of it rather than being about it, reading about it in a book or listening to lectures about it. You had a direct experience that really cracked you open.
That's right. And I hadn't read any books yet. So that was why a lot of people think, oh, you know, oh, what a great thing. And of course, I wouldn't change it. But because I hadn't read any material about it, it was a bit sort of disorienting.
Am I going crazy here or what?
Right, because
Yeah.
it didn't just eliminate my ego, or didn't eliminate all the habit patterns of my mind or all my complexes. So there was a long road still, you know, I'm still on that road of integration.
Yes, sure. Sure.
And the book is a big part of that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So tell us about, let's see what, I'm looking at my notes here. I know that among the other things that you do these days that you teach yoga, and I'm wondering, is it hatha yoga with the postures and the asanas, or is it some other aspect of yoga, because the yoga field is very, very broad?
Right. I am trained to teach the asana, but I don't. I teach the philosophy. So in various yoga teacher trainings in Southern California, I teach the yoga philosophy and psychology modules to the teacher trainings.
Okay, yeah, and that fits. I can really see that flowing out of, you know, out of the book, or vice versa. So your book is about consciousness as understood by Jung and Patañjali. Who was Patanjali, and when did he live? Give us the background on him.
So the background isn't as clean as we would maybe like it to be, or where, you know, we've kept more documented history, perhaps, or India does now, or perhaps we do in the West. So there definitely is varying times that they give to Patanjali, but most date him around the 2nd to the 5th century of the current era.
Of the current era?
Yeah.
Okay. And so would he have been after or before the Buddha? And another one that's maybe vague, but.
Right. So now some people do place him at the same time, but that's usually placed at 500 BCE. So again, you can see sort of the wide variance there.
Yeah.
But in most calculations, he would have been after.
Okay.
But yoga certainly preceded the Buddha.
And,
yoga itself, yeah.
Yeah, because it's very ancient. That I believe, you know, one of the things I've often heard referred to is the eightfold path of yoga, and that goes to Patanjali, right? Is he the person who articulated that?
Yes, that's right. So what Patanjali did was he basically brought together different strains of the schools and the thought that was already going on in India at the time. So Upanishadic thought, Vedantic thought, Buddhistic thought. He sort of put it all together in 195 very concise lines. And in the 2nd chapter, he lays out the Eightfold Path, which is a great way in, actually, perhaps for any of your listeners who might not be too familiar with Patanjali, for us to talk about that for a minute. You know?
Sure, go ahead.
So there's 8 limbs. A lot of people call them steps, but if we use the term steps, I encourage people to hold it very lightly, because we're not looking for anything particularly linear. So limbs is nice because it's sort of like, you know, a baby growing in a womb, right? All the limbs grow at the same time. And here are the limbs. The first one are the yamas, which are often referred to like as ethical precepts, basically, or, you know, a lot of people think of it as abstinences, but I'm going to list them because it's really, I find why Patanjali starting out on this limb sheds a lot of insight into what we really need right now out of yoga in the West for medicine. So it's non-harming, truthfulness, non-greed, walking in the awareness of the highest reality, brahmacharya, and non-stealing. And why I say we need that medicine right now is because we seem to be struggling morally and ethically. And, the non-harming, truthfulness, non-greed, I think those are things we could learn from strongly. And so again, Patanjali puts that as the first limb. The second limb is the niyamas, which is contentment, purity, tapas, purification, study, self-study and scriptural study, and then Ishvara Pranidhana, which is basically surrender to God. Then he has the asana, which you taught in the 70s, apparently, hatha yoga, the asana practice. And for Patanjali, asana, he only has about 3 sutras out of the 195 on asana, even though we've made it such a big part in the West, excuse me. Because for him, you want to take a comfortable seat in the body in order to move past all the dualities. So that's his third limb. Then he has pranayama, which is the breathing exercises. Then he has pratyahara, the sense withdrawal. And then he has
what was that? The what?
Sense withdrawal.
Sense of?
Sense withdrawal. Withdrawal, because in yoga,
okay.
In yoga, what the practice is aiming one towards is to remove the grasping towards objectification, to move the grasping towards objects, and to pull all those thought forms inside, internally, and to even continue to distill the internal thoughts. So it's a layered process of refinement, continuing to go in. And then the last 3 limbs are concentration, meditation, and absorption. Absorption, samadhi, the final limb. So again, they all work and flow together, not necessarily, like I'm saying, linearly. And for right now, I do think it's important in Western culture, because yoga is, I mean, it's a $6 billion, maybe even dollar industry. It's big, right, in Euro-American culture.
Yeah, which is amazing, because for a long time it wasn't, and it really, in the 60s, it suddenly exploded, 60s and 70s, and now there are yoga studios in just about every town, probably.
Right. Oh yeah. In LA, it's like on every half block. But you were one of the pioneers, right? You were one of the first ones, out
was
there.
in psychology, I think so. And I had a well-known colleague, Eleanor Criswell. Have you run across her at all?
No, I haven't.
I think she's one of the real pioneers. She taught for many years a yoga class at Sonoma State University and so on. And has been invited to speak in India and everywhere else, and written books. And so that's a different story, though. I want to stay with you. So yeah, definitely relevant for our times. And we see some very bad stuff modeled at the top of not just our government, but many other governments as well. So you kind of break it down in each of your chapters. There's certain themes that you kind of go into to show how Patanjali thinks about an issue, and then later how Jung thinks about an issue. So looking at Patanjali in yoga right now, what is the distinction between consciousness and unconsciousness? So what would you like to say about that?
Yeah, between Jung and yoga. So in Patanjali's world, consciousness, why I gravitated towards, and by the way, I studied Jung and yoga together for about 15 years. And that's why I decided on a dissertation to sort of look at them more in depth. Because I found I was hitting blocks, and I wanted to go deeper and find out what those blocks were between their different theories and
Uh-huh.
thoughts. So for Patanjali, again, he's sitting inside Upanishadic thought, which is, for those of your listeners perhaps who aren't familiar, we should maybe talk about the term Brahman, which is a term that stands for pure consciousness. It's also translated as self, capital S self. It's translated as God. But again, in that system of thought, consciousness is all there is. So for Patanjali, ontologically speaking, so having to do with the reality of our being, there can be no unconscious, because Brahman allows for no metaphysical splitting of reality. And this ends up being the key differential between Jung and Patanjali, and where they end up having passive transformation that are ultimately different. Even though they're both working towards the healing of human suffering, towards wholeness, it ends up being quite different, because right here at the get-go, with this ground of pure consciousness for Patanjali, it sets him basically on a different trajectory.
Is it non-duality versus duality? Is that the distinction?
Yes, that is one way to look at it. And if I could also add in, Patanjali is read through both a dualistic lens and a non-dualistic lens. The lens I take to it, because of my own pure consciousness event, is non-dual. So I read Patanjali through because he uses a dualistic metaphysics, Purusha and Prakriti, which we can also break down. But you're right. It ends up being, Jung remains dualistic, even though he talks about synchronicity, the unus mundus, and certainly, he's talking about that ontic whole beyond the dual the dual aspect monism that he speaks to, especially towards the end of his life with Pauli. But Patanjali definitely resolves all dualisms, and again, through this idea of pulling back all projections and becoming more and more and more internal, from the gross to the subtle, right? He's asking us to make a clear distinction between awareness or consciousness and appearance.
And how is Jung dualistic by contrast?
So Jung has a metaphysical split. So even though he writes about that his self maps to the Eastern self, you can find that in his collected works, probably in 11, collected works 11, but it doesn't actually map. He was kind of forcing it to happen. But as I'm saying, this term Brahman allows for no metaphysical splitting of reality. And Jung's self has both conscious and unconscious components, if you will, contents.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And then, go ahead.
So right there is kind of a major duality.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. For Jung, absolutely. So in Jung's view, human beings are making the creator conscious of his creation. Right? And you can get that in Memories, Dreams, Reflections very clearly. He states that. For Patanjali, again, consciousness is all there is. It's self-illuminating. If anything, what we're doing is we're embodying that, again, with the asana, where we're taking a comfortable seat beyond the dualities.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ongoing. Okay, so another thing that you examine, I don't know if you said everything you want to say about consciousness versus unconsciousness.
Well, the only other point I was thinking about there was, for Jung, it really remains within the realm of the contents of consciousness. And for Patanjali, again, he's really clear on discerning between a pure consciousness or a pure awareness, this pure perception, versus what is being perceived.
Yeah.
But Jung remains really within the realm of contents.
Okay. the next category that the next split that you take a look at is mind versus psyche.
Hmm. Hmm. So now, again, in the Jungian tradition, he prefers the term psyche because mind for Jung was too akin to rational thought. And again, for him, he doesn't actually really define psyche clearly, but once again, he talks about it in terms of conscious and unconscious contents. Um, and again, he has consciousness um, in reference to an ego. So again, all those psychic
Yeah,
contents will be in reference to an ego, whereas Patanjali talks about the mind's functions in a way that allows us to again, to have that impetus to keep pulling the mind back from its grasp and attachment onto sensory process or any objects at all. So he talks about it in terms of functionality as opposed to, you know, the mind grabbing onto contents and trying to build knowledge that isn't rooted in the pure consciousness. Are you with me there?
a bit. I mean, earlier you talked about the big S self and the little s self in the spelling, which is a distinction that Jung makes, and psyche. And I think of psyche, and it's like there's another realm for Jung, the archetypal realm, right? And it seems like it's reaching towards that more holistic realm that you're referring, but Patanjali evidently goes further with it than Jung does.
Yeah, because he goes beyond the image, right? So for Jung, it's so much of the transformation of the God image, right? Um, and that's all well and good. I mean, you know, I chose Jung because I really revere him. Certainly, again, as a woman, Jung has done so much for the Christian West, right? To speak from my own experience, like in Catholicism, and I really related to Jung when he talks about, you know, the dry ritual and not having the direct experiences.
Yeah,
So I really feel he's brought so much to the Christian West.
yeah,
And where he's going with the archetype, especially the archetype as such, where he talks about, you know, it's the pattern, like the akin to the pattern of behavior in biology. So he's, you know, he's deeply seeding God within the psyche. I mean, he's making great moves. He just passes away before his time to make
yeah,
some further ones.
yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, I mean, he left an amazing legacy for those of us who want to continue to work on that depth psychological path.
yeah. So in a way, they're both articulating the same stuff in some ways, but that uh, you say Patanjali went further and Jung died before he could get it all the way there.
That, yeah, perhaps. So we'll keep that as one possibility. And then, I mean, he did study Patanjali. He studied, as we talked about at the top, you know, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Secret of the Golden Flower. He studied a lot of the Eastern texts, but it could be seen that he just tries to co-opt that information and package it inside his psychology instead of really giving over into the Eastern mind.
Yeah,
And he felt as if, you know, Patanjali or you know, the yogis were sort of overreaching themselves. But it isn't truly the case. When we really follow Patanjali's path and get to a place of silence, which, by the way, if you look up silence in the index of the collected works, you get 3 references, of which none are directly linked to Jung's work. That in itself also opens the gap between Jung and Patanjali. I
yeah,
mean, right at the second sutra, Patanjali says yoga is the stilling of the mind stuff. Silence is really important to the path of yoga.
yeah, yeah. I love the anecdote that you share in the book where Jung goes to India to be honored to receive an award honoring him. And there's an opportunity for him to meet some of the most prominent holy men, gurus, You mentioned Ramana, Ramana Maharshi. Yeah.
Hmm.
And he declines that invitation. And in a way, you would think, well, boy, this would be a chance to really get in and really dig down into this stuff that he's studied and been interested in for so long. But he doesn't do it wanting, I believe the way you describe it, he's sort of worrying about getting pulled off of his own center. He doesn't want to get sucked into somebody else's trip. He feels like he is on the path of his own original experience.
Right, which is interesting given, this is a man who's studying all different kinds of psyches, right?
Yeah,
It's a very fascinating choice. Um, and perhaps telling. And if I remember the story correctly, I think he would go back to his boat, and he was studying the alchemical texts at the time. So have you ever been to India?
I have not.
Yeah, okay. Well, in India, for Westerners who have grown up in order, never mind, the Swiss Reformed Church, if it's anything, a Protestant, depending upon what kind of order there is, already in his church experience, and then also, perhaps again, given the suffering that he had within his own family dynamic and the order that he needed, besides the break with Freud, right? The order that he needed to continue to keep maintaining. India can throw anybody off their center, because the moment you step off the plane and you're
What
in
I
the
hear
airport, yeah.
is a total assault on the senses.
Yes, absolutely. And so if I remember the story correctly, he would go back to his boat and read the alchemical text. And I do think that speaks, it
Yeah,
speaks to us about his experience for sure.
yeah. I think there's a commonality there between him and Patanjali, that you must have your own personal experience of transcendence. And Jung was tracking that, and Patanjali also, right?
Oh yeah, direct experience for sure is
Yeah,
important. Yeah, to both.
yeah,
Yeah,
and I subscribe to that myself.
yeah,
It's like we get the people who are the head of a religion or something, and then there are all the followers, and the followers, that person who had that breakthrough experience struggles to find words to wrap around it. And then those can become kind of encrusted over time and turn into dogma that the followers mouth, but without having had that original touch of the transcendent.
that's true. It's so true. I mean, same with Christ and the Buddha, right? These big
Yes.
systems follow after them. And I think Jung was spot on in warning Westerners, you don't want to just put on the white turban. You don't want to just put on the white robe,
Yeah,
So his warnings are very appropriate, but then I put a but there,
yeah,
and
right.
say, we do have so many splits in the West. Science and religion are split. We most of us suffer under this real Cartesian dualism. The mind is split from the body, and of course, Jung was growing up in those splits, just like we still are. But it doesn't mean that those splits have to continue, and that's the
Yeah,
salve of yoga. It
right.
aims to remediate all of those
Yeah,
splits.
Jung was really, as you point out, so against Westerners taking on the garb of the East, but I don't know how he would deal with the way it's turned out, you know, that so many people have been so strongly influenced by Eastern thought. And we have these, uh, I'm thinking of places like Spirit Rock, where, and the whole way that Buddhism has taken hold of many people of Jewish origin, and I don't know if Jung would be rolling in his grave or rejoicing.
Right. Well, I think there was probably a period of time he was probably rolling in his grave, but there is, I would say there's a lot of great work going on in the last 5 years, 10 years,
Really?
especially. Are you familiar with Stephen Porges and the polyvagal theory?
Yes, yes, I've interviewed Stephen
Oh,
once
you
or
have?
twice.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. I got to go back and look for that one. I love his work, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
and there's papers now being written between polyvagal theory and yoga. And I think a lot of people pick up Patanjali's text and they don't really understand it. Now, with the work of Porges, with the work of Dan Siegel, it's allowed to be integrated a little bit more because it is coming through the Western mind. So these are just stages of digestion, is the way that I would put it.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Helpful and needed.
One of the things that was distinctive about Jung is his interest in science. Do you want to speak to that? And if there's a contrast there, you can speak to that.
Right. I mean, so he wanted a scientific psychology. He wanted his science to be based in empiricism. He wanted it, respected. So he kind of had one foot in and one foot out, is the way that I see it.
Yeah.
He understood the limitations, for sure, of empiricism. But at the same time, he never fully took a step beyond it. And again, that's what's required, not final turn, but, certainly pivotal points on the path of yoga is that continued dropping back where you don't hold on to any sense of an I. That holding on to the separate self, it really is let go of. So one can really surrender back into this notion that consciousness is all there is. I don't have to hold on to it. It's informing my gut, my heart, my brain, it's informing everything. I don't need to hang on to it.
I used to sort of bridle at the idea of the science of yoga. But then as time went on, I came to realize that they're both about observing reality. And one is about, the canons of science are that you observe and you report as well as you can, but it's kind of out there. And in yoga, it's like you can take an equally, what's the word I'm looking for? Not rigid, rigorous, an equally rigorous approach to looking inside, to going into your subjective world and seeing what's there.
Oh, right.
And learning from it.
It's very rigorous. It's very rigorous and very radically empirical. I mean, so as I had mentioned very briefly, how Patanjali uses this dualistic metaphysics of Purusha and Prakriti. And in English, we can say it's the seer and seen. So anything that we can see, anything, the most subtle thought form, an emotion, something happening in our nervous system, down in our gut. For Patanjali, that all falls in the category of Prakriti. So it's not just seeing five sensory perception on the front side of our eyes. Everything in that category is anything that can be perceived. And it's a radically empirical endeavor to continue to resolve, again, one place where Patanjali and Jung are very close are around the Jungian idea of complexes. Patanjali is right there in that same, different words, but this same idea of the habit patterns of the mind that are causing suffering. But again, Patanjali continues to pull back where you ultimately are able to discern between the seer and the seen. And again, Jung keeps the seer at this separate egoic I.
Yeah. I had a little thought going and I just lost it.
Oh, maybe it will pop back in.
Yeah, it probably will. It happens. This happens. Oh, I was thinking about the place in Western psychology. If you look at the history of Western psychology, there was this period of introspectionism where that was deemed to be, okay, that's how we're going to find out about the human mind and the human experience. And somehow it got dropped. They weren't able to come up with a vocabulary or anything that could tie it together in meaningful ways. And so introspection got dropped, moved more in the direction of behaviorism. In other words, we can't learn anything about people's minds through their subjective experiences because everybody's subjective experience is different. So what we'll look at is something we can agree upon, behavior.
Right.
Turns out that's kind of arbitrary too, that to look at something called behavior, you have to make decisions about what's going to count and what's not, where you're going to slice and dice that reality and say, okay, this is behavior. Now we're realizing more that we're in a continuity of flow all the time, right?
Yeah, definitely. There certainly is more of a qualitative turn. There's no doubt about. I mean, that's a long way to go.
Yeah.
But again, that was Jung's particular brand of genius, right? To have that introspective, like the deep dive into the shadow. What he terms the collective unconscious. And I think it's probably why Jung, has been so marginalized still to date.
Yeah.
Is
So in your final chapter of your book, you present your synthesis of Jung and Patanjali. What are your own big takeaways? You've done all this study in such detail.
um, Well, I believe in order for depth psychology or Jungian-oriented depth psychology, to move on, in, if I could, move beyond Jung and keep furthering the discipline, a turn towards yoga, like a Jung yoga fusion, could be really helpful. But in order to do that, they definitely have to find common ground in this. In pure consciousness, or consciousness, again, being the ground, being the fundamental ontological reality. And if the discipline would choose to make that turn, there's already so much of Jung's path that lines up. Again, his ideas on synchronicity line up there. His archetype as such, can be folded in right there if we were to make that turn. But again, even to give your listeners perhaps a different way in there, carrying on with what we talked about earlier with Porges, the work on the body, right? That's what depth psychology started with, right? The case of Anna O, and this idea that psychic experiences were leading some kind of pathological, existence outside of the center of the field of consciousness, and that affect was this empirical means of entering the psyche, and that we could release that affect, and then the nervous system would reset. That's all in yoga, right? I talked about like the breathing practices and the asanas.
Yeah.
So if we keep going along those same lines with depth psychology, but if we get out of, so if you do the metaphysical split that Jung did, what you're doing is you're making the unconscious a representation. You're representing the initial form of consciousness. Boy, how to articulate this? So just like we have the mind-body split in Western psychology, what we're showing is that, as Bessel van der Kolk so beautifully said in the title of his book, the body keeps the score. Or as Alice Miller says, the body never lies.
Right.
Why is that? Because there's consciousness at it doesn't matter, no pun intended, what you call it. You can call it matter, but ultimately it is a manifestation of consciousness, and it knows what it's doing.
I'm getting the image of the elephant and the blind people trying to describe the elephant. And it's interesting how universal that is, and how in the West we've touched on different pieces of this. Freud has people laying on a couch and reporting their what comes up in their mind. That's introspection. That's almost like meditation, right? But bent to a specific purpose. So there are all these different. Then you've got the body therapies that emerged out of. I'm going to block on his name now.
Oh, Reich?
Reich,
Was it
yeah,
Reich? Yeah,
thank
yeah.
you, Wilhelm Reich. So he's off on the elephant's foot, if you
Right,
will,
right.
and somebody else is in the elephant's trunk. So what can we, I want to touch on the current crisis that we're all experiencing. Can we take away from these two giants to help us get through the challenges facing us today in terms of the pandemic, the political divide, the push for social justice, climate change, and other threats to the planet? It's huge. What can we take away from all of this that helps us get through the day?
Yeah, it is huge, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because it is about, how do we make it right here, right now,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
If we subscribe to synchronicity, then we've all shown up on this planet at this time, in this moment, perhaps to make a giant turn, that we've hit a wall. This is why I really unpacked the yamas at the beginning when we talked about Patanjali's Eightfold Path, where he speaks to non-harming, non-greed, truth, right? Walking in the awareness of the highest reality, non-stealing. I would say, at the very least, for Euro-American culture, we need to find our ground with that. And whether the current leadership in politics is helping us do that or not, I'm not clear. But clearly, this idea that anything flies as truth, um, it's a problem.
yeah. I'll say it.
I mean, it's a problem. So how do we get on board, uh, you know,
Yeah,
again, with those yamas? And so we each have to do it individually. And then we look to see where the absences are within the culture. And even though Jung, again, one of his particular brands of genius was the collective unconscious, there were cultural blocks for him, right? There's blocks for all of us, right? But for him, like, he didn't he was, again, the ego, the consciousness as it relates to an ego, consciousness as it makes man. The way that Jung ends up articulating consciousness really reifies humanity. But as we can see all around us now, no, that consciousness that's within the earth, that's within the soil, that's within our organic food, that's in our sky, in our air, that we all stand on this beautiful rotating round rock. You
yeah,
don't discount that. It's not just matter. It's not unconscious. It has its own consciousness. And we have to get really serious at, considering looking at it that way.
now you're on
Um,
a roll.
yeah, in,
Preacher
or,
woman.
in order to sort of get out of this, either the desert or the forest, to whatever
Yeah,
metaphor you want to use, that we're in. Now we have to become very clear that we aren't the holders of knowledge, that
yeah,
as Patanjali teaches, knowledge is structured in this, and harmony, non-harming, non-greed. You can't steal from the planet without your planetary body being injured. You can't steal from other people's. You can't go to another culture, create slavery in order to plunder the earth so you can have, 100 t-shirts. Like, you can't do these things without repercussions.
yeah.
And right now we're sitting in an echo chamber of repercussions of
Right,
how
right.
we've lived for the last century or more.
Yeah. Um, what personal practices do you use to get you through the day um, as these problems seem to be intensifying?
Well, the first practice every morning is a gratitude practice.
Is,
So
is what practice?
a gratitude practice.
Gratitude. Yes. Good. Good.
So upon waking, I often also use two handholds. I put one on my chest and one on my gut.
Okay.
And upon waking every day, I just give myself sort of this little handhold. It's great biofeedback. Um, Standard, on most models, actually, is the biofeedback mechanism. And I have gratitude for my day, and that I am able to get up and be and work in a discipline that's part of transformation.
Yeah.
That's part of moving us hopefully towards healing and the eradication of suffering. So that's my first practice every morning. And then I do breathing practices often, which are 5-2-6-2. So 5 slow breaths on the inhale, holding 2. Then I extend it a little bit.
To a count of 5, inhaling to a count of 5. Yeah.
Yeah, inhaling on a count of 5, pausing on a count of 2, exhaling, extend it a little bit to a count of 6, and then pause again for a count of 2, and then repeat. And I also have a visualization practice with that, where I visualize the oxygen really going deeper and deeper into the nerve endings in my gut. Because again, I'm really influenced by Porges and his polyvagal theory. And even though I've practiced yoga for so long, Porges helped bring, things to light.
Wow,
for me more strongly as well. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to touch on before we wrap up here?
I would like to say that I do think that we should, keep hope alive, but that work is involved here, that this isn't, nobody's gonna sweep in and save us. That obviously I subscribe heavily to Patanjalian ideas, and that consciousness is all there is, and we're it. And so all the work that we do on ourselves and how we relate into the collective, it's all going to add up. So, for all the psychologists that I'm sure that listen to your podcast, or people who are, seeking psychological insight and healing, that as we continue to do the work, that we just keep gaining a greater community of people willing to take what is ultimately a really deep dive, into our own pain individually and also as a collective. But when we're willing to sit in the fire of that again, we meet up as community, and we offer each other, ways to co-communicate or pro-socially come together to develop something new.
Well, I appreciate your coming together with me today and feel inspired by that. And so, Dr. Leanne Whitney, I want to thank you for being my guest on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Dave, I really appreciate, or Dr. Dave, I really appreciate being here with you, and thank you so much for having me.